Hi, everyone. Here we are, lecture number 10. What we're going to be focusing on today is going to be life during the 1930s. We're looking at both life in America and life in Italy. Just a reminder, I will be giving you a list of terms, and I expect you to pick two of these terms, just like I used to put on the board on our face-to-face classes. And you're going to pick two of these terms and do a one-paragraph response to the term in relation to the overall theme of the lecture, and an additional one-paragraph response to one of the postings of your fellow classmates there on the discussion board. Okay, the terms we're going to be talking about today are going to be the Great Slump, Great Depression. We're going to be also, another term is going to be President Herbert Hoover, Hoovervilles, Hoovervilles, Hoover Flag, that's another term. An additional term will be Depression Life. Our next term will be fascism, Fascism. Our next term, Benito, that's spelled Benito, Mussolini, Mussolini. Next term, black shirts. And next term, Mussolini's slogans. Okay, well, looking at, we see really a roller coaster happening in American history. All that wealth that we talked about in the last lecture, the American businessman seen as a genius who could weave straw into gold, take something worthless and make it into something precious. No one understood how he was doing it, but suddenly they were just amazed that it was happening and enjoying the ride as far as it would go. They had felt that poverty was done with and the wealth and prosperity would continue forever. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. On October 29th, 1929, we're going to see the Great Depression or Great Slump, a tremendously horrific economic decline. Okay, on that horrible day, on October 29th, 1929, so almost at the end of the century, the end of the 20s, we suddenly saw people who were millionaires one day suddenly became impoverished overnight. All the things that they believed they could count on, all the things that they had taken for granted suddenly were no longer there. Now, I think particularly in today's times, we can definitely identify with them. Just like, we're wondering what's going to happen next, what's going to be the role of the government in trying to stabilize a difficult situation. And the people of the late 1920s felt the exact same way. Okay, so they one day had everything, the next day had nothing. Now, what's causing that? Well, basically, there were some early indications of some problems. And some of the early indications were there was an Austrian bank, for example, during the late 1920s that failed. And just like our economies are interrelated, so, why would China care if Americans have money? Well, they care because who's going to have the money to buy their goods? That would put them into recession. So same thing in the 1920s. One bank fails, that's going to be related to other banks failing. Okay, well, people were basically ignoring the failure of the Austrian bank and still continuing to live the good life and not putting much away with this assumption that things would always be wonderful. Now, as people saw the value of their stock portfolios declining during the October 29th, 1929, just as we're seeing today, we see, for example, our own stock market has declined since our recent problems of almost a third. So being nearly 30,000 on the Dow Industrial Averages down to below 20,000. Okay, so we're going to see in the late 1920s the same thing. Suddenly people see the value of their stocks declining. The natural thing is to do what? Are you going to want to hold on to it as the value declines? No, you're going to want to sell it. But unfortunately, that also shows lack of confidence in the economy. When other people see others selling off their stock, what's the natural thing to do? You're going to want to sell off your stock. So that's what they do. That one day, everybody's trying to get rid of their stock, and the more people that are trying to get rid of it, the quicker it declines in value. At the same time, there's also going to be a run on the banks. Now, with this run on the banks, basically, banks are going to have most of their money in investments. Banks don't make money by just holding on to the money that they take in. They make it by providing loans to people at higher interest rates than the interest rates that they pay to people. So just guarding your money is not how they make money. So very little of the money that they actually owe is actually available as liquid cash. So people go to the banks and they try to take out their money. Well, once they start taking out their money, the banks, they give out everything they have, and then the banks suddenly close. Well, if you see that happening to your bank, and it happens to a friend's bank, then people tell others, and everyone's going to run to the bank, and everyone's running, taking out everything they had, and basically a lot of the banks are going to close. Now, today we no longer have to worry about it because we have something started under Roosevelt called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which today basically guarantees your bank holdings up to $250,000. If you have more than that, and I don't suppose that's going to be a big problem for the majority of us, all you do is spread it around the different banks. Each bank is going to guarantee it, each account up to $250,000. But at this time, the banks run out of money. Everyone goes to try to get their money out of the bank. When the bank runs out of money, they close, never to reopen. Okay, so great fear factor. Just like, we have a great fear factor today because we don't know what's going to happen, what's ahead of us. They have that same uncertainty. So they're going to be looking for answers from the government. Well, just like today, when problems occur, who's the last person that anyone wants to blame? We never blame ourselves. We blame our parents, we blame our teachers, we blame our government, we blame, quote, society, whatever that is. It's too broad to really mean anything. But, we don't want to blame ourselves. Well, same thing at this time. And who are we going to look to for help? Well, at times when things seem horrible, we're going to go to the government and expect them to have answers. Well, the president at the time is going to be President Herbert Hoover, our next term. Now, President Hoover was a Republican president, and as a Republican, he's a strong believer in laissez-faire economics, the idea of a leave-it-alone economic philosophy. Basically, the idea that the government should have a hands-off approach to the economy. Hoover basically, the ideas he had were not particularly original, but at the same time, they weren't unconventional either. He basically said, look, capitalism is cyclical. It has its up times, it has its down times. We talked about that in the last lecture. And, if you wait long enough, things will get better. Well, when you're without food, you're without a job, without shelter, you don't want to hear, oh, eventually it'll get better. You want what's going to happen now. And Hoover did not have particularly, compassionate, warm kind of personality. He was kind of, cold and aloof. And, he basically said, life's tough, it's going to get better, you have to wait. And that's, of course, not what they want to hear. And we're going to see in some of the terms of the era, a lot of the, dislike generated towards President Hoover. For example, one of our other terms, Hoovervilles. Okay, Hoovervilles refer to places that people were living during the Great Depression. So non-permanent housing, living in shanty towns, living in abandoned cars, living in the woods in tents. These would all be examples of Hoovervilles. So calling it that, they're showing they're blaming this situation on President Hoover. Now, at the same time, they're also going to display what are called our next term, Hoover flags. Okay, a Hoover flag is the inside lining of your pocket, and you wear it inside out, showing the white lining with, no money or wallet in it, showing you have no money, and you're blaming it on President Hoover. So a lot of dislike of Hoover. Now, remember the American businessman. The American businessman was seen as a genius. Suddenly they're going to see him a lot different after the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, they're going to start seeing the American businessman, instead of just a general genius, they're going to see him as a greedy, selfish, Zionistic Jew. So when it was just the American businessman, his religion was not displayed. As soon as things go bad, they're going to say it's the fault of the Jews. So that's not going to be just the case in Europe. We see a lot of anti-Semitism here in the United States as well. Now, just like today, we're going to see, and we have seen recently, both the upside and the downside of mankind. People that would never do anything for their fellow man are suddenly being very compassionate and helpful. A lot of people putting out, messages that they're willing to help others. If it's an elderly person who shouldn't be out, they're willing to do shopping for them. They never would have done it before. But at the same time, you also see, scam artists come out of the woodworks in times of turmoil. So the good sides and the downsides of mankind. And we definitely see that during the Great Depression as well. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Depression life. So our next term. So life during the Depression, or Depression life. Okay, now just like today, we're forced to live a different way than we normally have lived, in the way that we want to live. Well, same thing during the Great Depression. So people start living a lot differently. They become much more creative, much more decisive, and just live in ways that they normally didn't live. They have to make do with much less because there's a lot of people unemployed, and they have to become very creative in ways to survive in ways that they didn't have to before. And in some ways, it gets you to appreciate the life that you had before when it's suddenly done away with. Okay, so during the Depression, you're going to see that part of this Depression era life is they start eating things that they normally wouldn't have eaten. For example, with very little food available, people start eating things like a common meal would be a bread and butter sandwich. Well, what's a bread and butter sandwich? Well, today we would call it a roll and butter. Another item that they would eat during the Great Depression would be a coleslaw sandwich. So they would just have coleslaw on bread. Would anybody eat this as normal food today? No. But at the same time, think of kind of the leftover part of a corned beef special or something. It still has a similar taste, the rye bread and the sweetness of the coleslaw and the crunch of the cabbage, and that's what they made a meal. Well, just like today, we like to eat out, and I think most of us today are, currently missing the fact that we can't eat in restaurants. So what did they do during the Great Depression if you don't have much money and still want to eat out? Well, they didn't do the dine and dash thing that some people, have done recently, but rather what they did was you would sit down in a restaurant. They would bring you out a glass of water. They would have next to your glass of water, they would have salt, they would have pepper, they would have ketchup, they would have mustard, and you would basically make a You put the ketchup and the salt and pepper in the glass of water, stir it around, basically have a very weak tomato soup. Mmm. No, but it was, kind of a clever thing. So the Great Depression made people count on things that they um, normally wouldn't have counted on, and come up with ways to, make it through the difficulties of the situation. So we see that in, various things. And does anyone know anyone who lived through the Great Depression? Maybe a great grandparent, or heard stories of people who lived through the Great Depression. Well, they have a whole different attitude about money and waste than we do. Just think of any of you work at a place that has a lot of seniors. You go to a place that restaurant that serves a lot of senior citizens. Do they throw a lot of things out? No, they'll have like half a roll, and they'll wrap it to go, and they'll grab a whole lot of sweetened loaves, and things that probably most of us wouldn't do. Or if you have stale bread, or even bread that's partly moldy, they'll cut off the mold, or they'll make the stale part of the bread into bread pudding. So things that we normally wouldn't do. Now, some people I've known who have gone through the Great Depression, once again they showed their frugality. For example, I had a great uncle who died with over 100 bacon cheeseburgers in his freezer. They used to have them at Roy Rogers. They were 99 cents, and he basically stockpiled them. Another thing that he used to do was he would take generic brand ginger ale and dilute it by 3/4. So, 4 ounces of ginger ale, 12 ounces of water, and mix it. You can imagine what it tastes like, but it was a way of making it go further. So things that we normally wouldn't consider. Now, I even had a student in my class a couple years ago, and she mentioned that upon his passing, her grandfather left her his car. Well, in the lining of the car, what did she find? She actually found in the lining of the trunk, he had something like $5,000 in cash. Why? Because, people of that era did not trust the banks, and understandably, they did not trust the banks. So they would hide it in various places. A common place was, for example, in the freezer. So very, resourceful, very hard life. And, people that have, we're seeing today the run on the toilet paper. Well, the same thing. People of the Great Depression era, some of them have, when their relatives have gone through their homes upon their death, lo and behold, what do they find there? 40 to 50 bars of soap, 50 rolls of toilet paper, things that we would normally laugh about. But, notice what are the kind of things that people are trying to get today? Toilet paper and soap. So, definitely some connections there between the two. Now, you also saw a lot of people during the Great Depression who were very willing to help others. People took people in, people they didn't even know or knew barely, because they just did not want them to starve. There were examples of teachers. Teachers in the Chicago school district. There were some examples of one who actually was teaching his class. He fainted, and from lack of food, because they really didn't have very much money to pay the teachers, because they weren't collecting much in taxes, because no one was working. Does it have a familiar ring to it? So what the teacher, fainted in front of his class, and then what did the people do? He suddenly woke up and just continued right where he was. So even though he wasn't being paid, he was still very willing and to do his job, which he found to be a very important job. So, interesting things happening during this time, this horrific time during the Great Depression. Now, when did things begin to get a little bit better in America? Well, with Roosevelt. Okay, President Roosevelt, or FDR, and you'll go into him in I would imagine a fair amount of detail in your U.S. history course. But Roosevelt's going to come up with what's called the New Deal. So, offering people a lot of things that the government's going to do to make their lives bearable, and changes the relationship between the government and the individual. So all these things happening during the time of the Great Depression. Now, Roosevelt was a different kind of person than Hoover. Roosevelt was very, friendly and warm and inspired confidence, and communicated directly to the people by means of his fireside chats. People would huddle around the fireplace and listen to Roosevelt telling them what the government's going to do to make things better for them. So he inspired this confidence, and it helped people get through this dark days of the Depression. Okay, now let's focus a little on what's happening in Italy during the Great Depression. So things are not just happening in America, of course, but also in Europe. Okay, we talked a little bit about Germany in the period after World War I in our last lecture. Now let's talk a little bit about life in Italy. Okay, now remember, in Europe after World War II, there's going to be the rise of this totalitarianism, which we talked about before. And one of the types of totalitarianism that we begin to see is in Italy. We're going to see the rise of what's called fascism. So another term. So our term fascism, it's totalitarianism on the far right politically. Fascism is going to have a connection with Nazism. Sometimes sometimes fascism is going to be called Italian Nazism, and sometimes Nazism is called German fascism, because both are totalitarian movements on the far right. Okay, so let me paint the situation here in Italy after World War I. Things were pretty desperate in Italy after World War I. Basically, the Italians were starving. There just was no food to go around. The Italians, known for their wonderful cooking, were basically going through garbage cans looking for anything they could find to give them food. Southern Italy, which is much more agriculturally based, was doing, of course, better than Northern Italy, which is more industrially based. But Italy in general was without much food. At the same time, they're going to have in Italy, right after the war, as early as 1919, they're going to have over 100 different strikes going on at the same time. Well, who is a strike really going to hurt? Well, it's going to hurt the people who need the goods. It's going to hurt the worker. He's not getting paid. And it's also going to hurt the company owner or employer, who are not getting anything done and thus not making any money. So basically all these strikes going on are not really helping anyone. Some other things going on in Italy are Italy is also going to have they're going to send to the peace talks, there at the Treaty of Versailles, the wrong kind of representative. The representative they had was basically a guy who was a warm, friendly, grandfather-like figure who everybody liked, but he really didn't explain to the people there at the Treaty of Versailles how bad the situation was in Italy, so they really didn't fully know. Now, what you're also going to see is, there's going to be a lot of people who are very angry after World War I in Italy. Just like the Germans didn't understand why they lost, the Italians are also not going to understand why they lost. And what made it particularly hard is there's going to be a lot of underemployment in Italy. Now, underemployment's a bit different than unemployment. Underemployment would be a job beneath your skill level. So if you're trained to do one thing, it would be doing a job, but a job vastly different. So it would be someone like with a law degree working as the fry guy in the McDonald's. So you have a job, but it's not a job commensurate with your skills. So underemployment causing a lot of anger there in Italy. The lack of food all these strikes. The Italians feel demoralized for having lost the war. So all these factors in place, and these are all going to help lead into the rise of fascism. Okay, so how did the fascist movement start? Okay, the founder of the fascist movement is going to be Benito Mussolini, another term. So Benito Mussolini is the founder of the Italian fascist movement. Okay, it starts off as a fringe movement. It starts off in Milan, northern Italy, in the year 1919 with something like 200 followers. Okay, 200 followers is a fringe movement. That's not going to be anything particularly important. Look how it's going to change. Okay, 18 months later, it reaches 20,000 followers. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that he's saying something and there's something that is inspiring confidence in him. So just like Roosevelt inspired confidence in America, Mussolini is going to inspire confidence in Italy. So he's getting a lot of followers very quickly. He's saying things that people want to hear. Now, look at this jump. By 1922, so 3 years after the start of the fascist movement, Mussolini is already going to have 250,000 followers. So it's becoming very, very popular. Well, what is making Mussolini so popular? What is he saying? What is he doing that so many people want to follow him? Well, one thing he's going to do is he's going to unite people by kind of bringing them together. One thing he's going to do is he's going to tell them that things are going to get better. He tells them if you give him a chance, things will get better. And so kind of a similar message to what Roosevelt had. He's also going to have slogans. You know, what is a slogan? Where do we see it today? Well, today we see it often in business. You know, for example, Nike, just do it. You know, what does that mean? Go out and buy the $125 sneakers made in Vietnam for $10. Don't think about it. Just go buy it. Or another, you know, slogan, Virginia is for lovers. You want to experience love in its many splendid and strange forms, get down there to Virginia Beach, where anything goes there under the boardwalk. Okay, so kind of a way of, you know, uniting people, a quick message that brings people together. Okay, so here are the Mussolini slogans, another term. 3 of his slogans are believe, obey, and fight. Okay, so do what you're told and just listen to Mussolini. Another one is a moment on the battlefield is worth a lifetime of peace. So what is that saying? It's saying it's worth a sacrifice because in the long term, it's going to create a better society. And this one, my own personal favorite of the 3, Mussolini is always right. Well, you know, pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I have to go into that one. All right, so what are some other things that Mussolini's going to do? He's going to bring the Italians together by telling them that they are the greatest people ever. He says, you're descendants of the Roman Empire, and we're going to create another Roman Empire, and I'm going to lead you as the new Caesar. You know, you're not only the best looking people, the best dressed people, the bravest people, but also the smartest people. So, of course, we're going to go to our natural destiny, and things are going to become great again. Now, if things are going lousy, don't you want to hear that? Don't you want to hear things are going to become great? Sure. So they're going to follow Mussolini, you know, and he's going to guarantee things are going to get better. And people want to hear how things are going to get better. Now, he also makes kind of like Hitler, he's going to make a strong dichotomy with the idea of you're either with us or against us. So he's going to create this idea of a uniform. Well, let's think of a minute of what that means. Where do we see uniforms? Well, you see it in the name, uni, one, form. So bringing people together. The uniform of the firefighters, the uniform of the police, the uniform of the businessman, the old uniform of the professors with the tweed jackets, long dead by now. But these are the things that bring people together. So, what uniforms does he create? He's going to call the followers of Mussolini the fascist soldiers. He's going to refer to them as our next term, the black shirts. So the black shirts are the followers of Mussolini and especially the soldiers. Okay, so he is going to quickly come to power. He's going to become very popular. There's going to be a general election in 1924, and he, in that election, is overwhelmingly going to get the vote. So he takes this as a mandate from the people, and he's going to quickly make a lot of changes in Italy that, in the short run, make things a whole lot better. So even today, some of the well, now they're pretty much dead, but I remember growing up, some of the people that lived during the World War II era, they would still, as late as the 80s and 90s, talk about Mussolini as a great hero. So someone that, made things better after the hard, economic realities after World War I.